What does your team see when they look at your face? Not your presentation, not your strategy, not your numbers, your face. Because I've noticed something. During a crisis, people stop listening with their ears first. They start listening with their eyes. Sighs. I learned that the hard way. 3 years ago, the numbers stopped making sense. Not dramatically. That's the dangerous part. Nothing exploded. Nothing crashed overnight. The dashboard simply stopped telling the same story it had been telling for months. Sales had slowed. Forecasts no longer agreed with each other. Our largest customer delayed a decision they had promised us for weeks. Finance had one explanation. Sales had another. Operations had a third. Every meeting ended with more opinions than certainty. Pause. That wasn't what worried me. What worried me was that everyone kept looking at me after every conversation, not because I had the answer, because they hoped I did. That's a very lonely place to stand. The strange thing about leadership is this. People rarely tell you they're studying you. They simply do it. How quickly did you answer? How long did you pause? Did your voice sound different today? Did you interrupt more than usual? Did you stop making eye contact? Did you suddenly begin saying, "Everything's fine," far more often than you normally would? That made me curious, because nobody had asked me whether I was worried. Yet somehow, everyone already seemed to know. I'd always believed leadership happened through decisions. That week, I started wondering if it actually happened through emotional leakage. You see, every organization has two conversations happening at exactly the same time. The conversation you can hear, and the conversation people quietly build inside their own heads. The first one sounds like this. We've got a supply issue. The client has delayed. We're reviewing our forecasts. Perfectly ordinary business language. The second conversation sounds very different. Should I update my CV? Is my job safe? Does leadership know something they aren't telling us? Should I start preparing for the worst? Nobody says those things in the meeting, but they're often the loudest conversation in the building. That was the moment something stopped making sense to me. Every executive meeting was becoming more emotional, not because people were shouting, because certainty was quietly disappearing. And whenever certainty disappears, human beings become remarkably creative. Unfortunately, we become creative in all the wrong directions. We invent explanations. We predict disasters. We mistake confidence for competence. And the loudest voice in the room suddenly starts sounding like the safest one to follow. That observation bothered me, because the loudest person in the room wasn't necessarily the one with the best judgment. Sometimes they were simply the least comfortable with uncertainty. There's a difference, a very expensive one. I'd been assuming my job was to remove uncertainty as quickly as possible. Then I realized something. Maybe that wasn't possible. Maybe my real job was preventing uncertainty from becoming panic. Those are completely different leadership problems, and they require completely different leaders. Those are completely different leadership problems, and they require completely different leaders. For the next few days, I started watching people more carefully than the spreadsheets. Not because the spreadsheets weren't important, because people were beginning to tell me something the numbers couldn't. One manager walked into every meeting with a new theory. We've lost the market. It's pricing. It's the competitors. It's marketing. Every day the explanation changed. Only the certainty stayed exactly the same. Another leader said almost nothing. He simply kept asking, "What evidence do we have?" At first, I thought he was slowing us down. A week later, I realized he was the only person preventing us from making very expensive mistakes. That made me question something I'd believed for years. I'd always admired leaders who answered quickly. Now, I wasn't so sure, because speed and clarity aren't the same thing. Neither are confidence and judgment. And certainty isn't the same thing as leadership. Some of the worst decisions I've ever seen weren't made by frightened executives. They were made by executives who became certain far too early. That's when I realized uncertainty isn't actually the enemy. Premature certainty is. Think about the last organizational crisis you experienced. Maybe sales slowed unexpectedly. Maybe funding disappeared. Maybe regulations changed overnight. Maybe your largest client walked away. What happened first? The problem? Or everyone's explanation of the problem? I've noticed explanations spread through organizations faster than facts. Somebody says, "This is definitely what's happening." Within hours, people stop testing the idea. They start protecting it. That's incredibly dangerous, because once people become emotionally attached to an explanation, they stop investigating reality. That frightened me far more than the crisis itself. So I changed one habit. Before every leadership meeting, I stopped asking, "What's our message?" Instead, I asked myself 3 different questions. What do we know? Not what we think, not what we hope, not what we're afraid of. What do we actually know? Then, what don't we know yet? I found that question surprisingly calming, because it gave uncertainty somewhere honest to live. We didn't have to pretend. We could simply acknowledge the empty spaces. Then came the question that quietly changed my leadership. What's the next decision? Not the final decision, not the perfect strategy, just the next decision. Because organizations rarely collapse because leaders can't predict 6 months ahead. They struggle because leaders become paralyzed trying to solve 6 months before solving today. That one shift changed the atmosphere in the room. People stopped chasing certainty. They started building momentum. Momentum creates confidence far more reliably than predictions ever do. Then one afternoon, someone thanked me for staying so calm. I almost laughed. Because I wasn't calm, not really. I'd been awake at 3 o'clock that morning. I'd imagined worst-case scenarios. I'd questioned every decision I'd made that quarter. I'd done exactly what every other leader quietly does when the future becomes foggy. The difference wasn't that I felt less fear. The difference was that I'd stopped believing my fear needed an audience. That might be the biggest misunderstanding about calm leadership. People think calm leaders don't experience anxiety. The best leaders I've worked with absolutely did. They simply refused to make their anxiety someone else's operating system. That sentence changed the way I understand leadership forever, because emotions don't stay inside boardrooms, they travel. One anxious executive creates anxious managers. Anxious managers create anxious teams. Anxious teams stop experimenting, stop speaking honestly, stop making brave decisions. Before long, everyone is protecting themselves instead of protecting the organization. Leadership isn't only about deciding where people should go. It's about deciding the emotional environment they'll travel through to get there. If the environment becomes fear, good people begin making small decisions for self-preservation instead of good judgment. That's how cultures quietly change, not through one dramatic speech, through hundreds of tiny emotional signals. So these days, when somebody tells me, "You always seem calm in a crisis," I quietly smile, because calm isn't something I feel. It's something I choose to protect, not for me, for everyone who's watching my face before they ever hear my words. Because eventually, I realize something I wish I'd understood much earlier. The organization doesn't need me to predict the future. It needs me to protect the quality of thinking while the future is still unclear. Those are very different responsibilities, and perhaps that's the quietest definition of command I've ever found. Not knowing exactly where the fog will end, but making sure nobody loses their ability to think while walking through it.